Tension's building, isn't it? Alright, so you might be wondering, why Europe? 1986 hit song, The Final Countdown, which is recently been made popular by, I think it's a Geico commercial out there right now. But it does have significant relevance because, ladies and gentlemen, this is the social order of the 18th century. And, you know, again, the social aspect of history is a pretty big theme on the new AP curriculum. Always has. I'm sure it always will. But we've already talked about how the agricultural revolution and the early industrial revolution hurt the lower classes in some regards, with enclosure and, again, taking away their independence. Even the proto-industrialization and the cottage industry that had served them well, it's going to be stripped of them. And again, in this brief episode, we're going to discuss how demographic patterns and family life changed as people started to, by the end of this century, move into cities. And what is the final countdown? Why is it relevant? Because, boys and girls, the French Revolution is on the horizon, and this old social order, it's almost over. Their days are numbered. So that's why I chose the final countdown. I hope you enjoyed it. So what we want to focus on here is the main groups making up European social order, and we'll focus on that right away and explain how the conditions in which people lived differed between the groups and between the different parts of Europe. So here we go. The social status, the social order of the 18th century. Social status was not necessarily determined like today by wealth and economics. It was based on the traditional hereditary feudal social orders, the estates. In fact, this is, again, traced back to the Middle Ages with feudalism. And what do I mean by the estates? We'll get into that, but the first estate, second estate, and the third estate. So the old order, or sometimes it's referred to as the Ancien Regime, which if you Pittsburghese that, it would be Ancient Regime. Or, I don't know, that's probably not even Pittsburghese enough, but the Ancien Regime is what we're talking about. And this is the old order. And again, it was, for the most part, hereditary, meaning, ladies and gentlemen, you're born into it. Very few people, I should say, could move up. Examples of people that have moved up, the only one that I can think of off the top of my head from being like a peasant class into the middle class was Martin Luther's father, who had done that in the mining industry. Remember, he wanted to be a lawyer. Then we don't want to get into that anyway. Storm, stay away from lightning bolts and stuff like that. But the other thing that we've talked about this year, where people could move up, again, it was very rare, were the wealthy merchants or the bourgeoisie in France, who had in many ways purchased their way into the nobility. And if you remember, we called those people nobles of the robe. So anyway, during the Dark Ages, listen, no one questioned this order, this structure in society, because survival depended on the matter. As the Dark Ages start to come to a close, the church supports this hierarchy with scripture and teaching that everyone needs to fulfill their duties. And again, the church was at the top. They wanted to maintain that status quo. So an example of not just the Catholic Church, but the Protestant churches supporting this would be Luther's reaction. Remember, stab, smite, and slay the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt in 1524. We talked about him being a conservative revolutionary, but there's a great example as well. So, you know, in a lot of cases, the Catholic Church, the Protestant churches actually supported this social order because it was stability. So at the top, listen, you had the clergy, and we'll get into them in a second, but, you know, usually 1 to 2% of the population of, especially France, but Europe for that matter. You know, below them you had the nobility, which was the aristocracy. We'll talk about their stats in a little bit, but the commoners, everybody else, no matter how rich or poor you were in the third estate or the commoners. Remember, this will include the wealthy merchants, the wealthy bourgeoisie, and what we sometimes call the new money. They were still in the third estate. All right. Now, marrying, we talk about protecting the old order. Marrying between these classes was strictly supervised, and in some areas, like Prussia, the government actually had to approve. So, again, a little quick story off the beaten path. Just read recently a story about Franz Ferdinand. Had married his wife Sophie, and I wasn't aware of this till recently, but she was middle class. You know, these are the two people that were assassinated in Sarajevo that started the First World War, but he married a middle class woman, and it was very, very highly controversial in Austria. Now, you know, it kind of reminds me of every Christmas movie that my wife watches on the Hallmark Channel, where, you know, king, crown, nobility marries, you know, some maid or somebody from a lower class. But anyway, that was a rare occasion. Sorry to rip on the Hallmark Channel if you love it, and if my wife's listening to this, my apologies. But anyway, not really. You make me watch those. I don't apologize. Enlightenment thinkers argued that the traditional social order didn't make sense. It was illogical. It wasn't reasonable. You know, it didn't make sense. So how can society have progress if it's so closed-minded? And some of the best minds, if you think about this, and again, I'm going a little bit philosophical here on you, you know, if you think about it, this hadn't changed. You know, some of the best minds in history were not rich. And I'm talking about modern history. You know, you think about Henry Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Edison, going a little U.S. history. I even throw Einstein in the mix. You know, they weren't nobility. You know, they were people that, in some cases, it was rags to riches. They were able to rise as far as their ideas and their talents could take them. You know, but the bottom line is a lot of the old guard, the old regime, is hostile to progress. And this is the significance. I hope you get this out of this class. And, you know, if you don't take the test, and, you know, I know some of you guys are like, why in the heck did I take this class? But, you know, there are many lessons here. This is what the French Revolution will begin to change. And, you know, if you think about it, America, this is what America was built on. This is what made America different than Europe. That right off the bat, I mean, the people that settled here, dissidents, religious dissidents, people that were persecuted, or, you know, second-born sons of Europe who, you know, basically had no path to the manners of their families. They were like kind of excluded from the real fruits of the nobility. They came here to start from scratch. And so right off the bat here, it was, you could go as far as your talent and work ethic can take you. And coincidentally, it's still that way. Ask people that come here from other countries. Now you ask the people that are here, and I'd like to take a shot at some of you that are lazy and, you know, that really don't like to do work, and, you know, you look at that stuff and, oh my God, I'm not going to be a doctor because it takes too long. You know, those people from other countries, they embrace that stuff. Anyway. I'll get off my soapbox. I'll get back down. So let's talk about the lowest group first, the peasants. They made up roughly 85% of the population. Conditions for them varied region to region, and the biggest difference were really between legally free peasants in Western Europe and then the serfs that existed in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, newsflash, if you haven't figured this out, the further east you went in Europe, in this area, the more backwards, the more feudal society was, where the nobles controlled vast lands and controlled every part of society. And the kings needed the power of the nobility, so they didn't really question the social structure all that much. Guys, that'll continue all the way into the 20th century. So there's a little bit of continuity and change over time for you. Taste that. Synthesize that. But anyway, peasants had compulsory, or what we call mandatory service requirements that they had to carry out. And you had tithes, or tithing, and they had to give a third of their crops to the church. And aristocrats, in many cases, the money didn't end up in the hands of the church. It went to the wealthy nobility. So you're screwed there. But anyway, that's what they had to do. So a third of your crops, a third of your ability to make money went to the people that own the lands and the powers that be. So that's not a good thing for you, obviously. And under mercantilism, many aristocrats, if you remember, were granted monopolies by the government over a lot of the early industries, whether it's flour mills and things of that nature. And you know, the fact that they had a monopoly, it stifled competition, so they were able to rake the peasants over the coals with what they charged them for wheat, flour, and the stuff that they produced there and their ability to make food and eat food, or consume food, I guess I should say. But So they're taking it on the chin there. And additionally, there were miscellaneous dues and fees which peasants were forced to pay to the aristocracy. In fact, in some cases, the book brought this up, they denied hunting rights even on some of the land that they owned, or they rented, like in tenant farmers. You couldn't hunt on land that you worked continually. So there's a deer on your land, you could feed your family for like a week or whatever. I don't know. I don't hunt, so I don't know really how long that meat would last you. But just go with it, all right? And you weren't allowed to. So, in times where there was famine or there was crop failure, this was a way for you to feed your family, and you could be thrown in jail or you had to pay a special tax. They weren't really happy about that. Again, I refer back. This happened with the Peasants' Revolt in Germany. This is one of the things that the peasants were trying to change. Again, if you remember, Luther said, you know what, this isn't the time. I need the help of Frederick the Wise of Saxony. I don't want to make these German princes turn on me. So he said, stab, smite, and slay the peasants. But anyway, serfdom. In Eastern Europe, aristocrats had almost complete legal and social and economical control over their serfs. It was borderline slavery. And this is what Joseph II tried to reform in Austria. Obviously, sorry, Joseph, to no avail. And one other thing the book focuses on, the village. The village was the center of the social life for the peasants. They were, usually they attempted in the village to provide people order, make sure everybody was abiding by the laws. They offered poor relief through the church. They offered, in some cases, education, usually through a schoolmaster, but it was pretty primitive at best. And they collected taxes for the government. So that was what the village was supposed to do. And this was the notion. This was the fundamental central part in the peasants' lives in the pre-agricultural revolution open field system of Europe. What were the diets of them? If you lived back then, what'd you eat? Well, you pretty much didn't change from the Dark Ages, people. You ate dark bread. Water, okay. Wine, maybe you like wine, maybe you like beer, so you're thinking, hey, life's good. But basically soups of grain and veggies. And the fact that this diet was so poor makes them more and more susceptible to disease. Okay? So let's go into the nobility next. Nobility made up only 2 to 3% of the population of most of Europe. In particular, a lot of these numbers resemble pre-revolutionary France. And as we know, the noble status was based on birth. Automatically, you were at the top of the social scale. Why? Because it's where you were born. They had legal and social privileges. Again, privileges meaning it was good to be in the nobility. When they got in trouble, they were judged by their peers, not everybody. So, nobles took it easy on one another. The peasants didn't judge you. It was your fellow nobles. You also had immunity from torture, and you had exemption from the most important thing here. You were tax exempt, baby. So good to be a noble. And again, don't forget, the further east you went, you had more direct power over your lower classes, including your serfs. Now, what was the diet of the aristocracy? Meat, fish, cheese, sweets, chocolate. Look at the picture, all right? Sweets, and again, it's a lot tastier and in some cases a lot more nutritious than those peasants. In fact, the money that you had began to make it possible for the rich middle class to buy their way into the nobility. But let me get you the story of the chocolate, the painting here, which is painted by a guy that I can't even remotely pronounce. But it's a family of a duke, and they're drinking chocolate. And what this communicates is the significance of chocolate in the early France in several ways. First, the duke was of the French court, and he was known for his wealth, meaning he and his family were an elite in society. And this distinction is important because when chocolate was first introduced to France, it was mainly a commodity of the elite and those who could afford it. So second in this painting, the family is enjoying chocolate together, demonstrating the social aspect of chocolate. At this time, chocolate was often consumed with company at banquets and other important social functions, allowing the host to show off their sophistication and their prestige. So therefore, the presence of chocolate in this painting, you probably didn't know this, signifies that this family is filthy rich and filthy high in status, and it highlights the social elements of chocolate. I bet you're hungry now. So anyway, the aristocracy and the nobility controlled all the top positions in the military and the government, and it was believed that they were born to command. You think about why would this make sense? It doesn't make sense to us now, but back then they justified it, all right? It was believed they were born to command. That's why they were born into that class, and they were more fit to lead because of their social status. Well, Napoleon and the French Revolution will come along and prove this isn't true. In fact, one of the reasons why Napoleon's army is able to run rampant over a lot of European powers is their European powers are still run by the nobility, and Napoleon makes it so that the best officers, no matter what their social status, if they're good, they rise in rank. And so they open a can of you-know-what on a lot of the old regime. And it's going to change the way things are run in Europe. So stay tuned for that. So again, the nobility, one other thing that the book makes a point to say is they're not the same everywhere. There were differences in wealth, education, and political power, both within these countries, but also between the countries. An example, British lords would often lease their land to tenant farmers to make a little bit more money. But in Eastern Europe, they didn't need to do that because they still had serfs to work their lands, basically like slaves. And the nobles in Russia and Prussia will serve the states, where in Spain and Italy, they had few official state duties. So it was a little bit similar in some aspects. We're comparing and contrasting, but in some areas it was totally different. So, and again, money made it possible for the rich middle class to start buying their way into the nobility, as we talked about, the nobles of the robe. And why would they do this? Hey, man, if you get into the nobility, you're tax exempt. Why wouldn't you? All right. So we're going to get into the aristocracy and the aristocratic way of life. So in the 18th century, this is known as the Golden Age. And by the way, the final age of the landed aristocrat. They had all, as we said, the privileges, the power. Final century before the Industrial Revolution comes along to change this. Before the rise of the middle class, and also it's before the political changes and the bloodshed and beheadings, of course, of the French Revolution. And the center of this aristocratic way of life was the country house and the aristocratic rural property. This was the focal point. It marked their domination of the local area. And the Georgian style, as it was called, the country house in England, was influenced by the architecture of Andrea Palladio. And, the country house, it was focused on comfort, practicality, and beauty and prestige. The new desire for greater privacy created upper floors for personal affairs, lower affairs for public activities, and parks and gardens began to be built around the country to provide even greater separation from the lower class. And this kind of reminds me, if you've ever been to Williamsburg, which is again not too far off of this area. I mean, Williamsburg and Jamestown founded in 1607, so we're talking about the same area. But you look at these, and some of the early houses in Virginia were Georgian in style, and they had the boxwood gardens in the back. And if you've been to any of those places, you kind of understand what that's all about. Subsequently, another big part of the aristocratic way of life was the grand tour. I wish I could have gone on a grand tour. But the sons of the wealthiest people in Europe, including, this was really popular in England, were keen on something called a grand tour. You had to have a lot of money because you were going to spend a lot of money. What were you going to spend a lot of money on? Well, you're going to go for an educational tour. You can see you're coming down England, you go into Paris, you go down through Germany, you go into Italy, and you're going to see all the places that you've read about and you've learned about. It's going to cost a lot of money. You're going to have your personal tutors, thanks to Rousseau, to come along and make it educational. And when you're there, you're going to be very interested in wine, women, and song, as the book says. So think about this in today's terms. It's spring break, but not to Panama City. All right? It's spring break to Rome, to see the Sistine Chapel, to look at art, to visit St. Peter's, to drink and meet women, to visit Paris and learn culture and sophistication, and to meet, drink, and meet women. All right? But that's the grand tour. Okay? Make sure you have a little bit of that as an example if that comes up on the test. And again, let's talk about towns and cities, because these are going to change. The minority of the people in the 18th century lived in cities. It's not going to change until the official Industrial Revolution. Remember, still rural until enclosures in England. So most urbanized areas in Europe included the Dutch Republic, Britain, and northern Italy. And the biggest city of Europe at this time was London, which had approximately 1 million people. Now, don't think you'd want to live in the cities necessarily. The death rates were higher there because they were unsanitary, polluted water, polluted drinking water, lack of sewage facilities, and there was overcrowding. I mean, people just dump stuff in the streets. Ugh, rats, So Last thing, the problem of poverty, okay? Many of the poor were forced to turn into begging and prostitution. Spielvogel makes a point to make sure you know this. And the earlier attitudes toward the poor had always been that it was the Christian duty, the church's duty to take care of them, charity. However, since Calvinism, the Reformation, and Lutheranism, really Calvinism and the visible elect and predestination, being poor was more and more seen as a sign of not being elect by being lazy, and you deserved it. So thus there wasn't as much charity during this particular time frame. We mentioned this a little bit when we went over the witchcraft craze of the 17th century. I don't know if you remember doing that, but starting in the late 16th century, the old attitude about the poor began to change, okay? And by the 18th century, it was argued that charity to the poor was you're just encouraging laziness, idleness, and vice, and crime, and all that other stuff. So, really one of the things that we need to know is the problem of poverty was really an unsolved mystery of the Enlightened era, all right? Since in some cases, there were attempts to change it. In France, they experimented with public works projects, road building, and things of that nature, where if you were poor, you're out of work, you got listed almost like in prison to these public works projects. But they didn't work. So poverty remains a big problem at the end of the 18th century. It will so into the 20th century, let's face it. And it's going to be further complicated with the age of the Industrial Revolution, where there's more societal shifts that occur. So, and as we know it throughout history, change is usually good in the long run, which it will be, but it is oftentimes balked at and fought tooth and nail as it happens. So the poor and the middle class are about to bring about some changes in chapter 19 that we'll cover in the next chapter, in the next unit. So I leave you with their theme song, Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It, circa 1984.